She stood on the auction block, the rough wood digging into the soles of her bare feet. The year was 1867. The place was Dodge City, and she was about to be sold like a piece of livestock. Her name was Rebecca Yoder, and just a few weeks ago, she'd been part of a quiet Amish community in Pennsylvania. Now she was cast out, disgraced, and facing a fate she couldn't even bring herself to imagine. The rope tied around her wrist was coarse and biting, a constant reminder of how far she had fallen. A burly man with breath that smelled of stale whiskey and cheap cigars shoved her forward. "Step lively, girl," he growled. "Got paying customers waiting." The crowd below was a blur of leering faces and hungry eyes. Men in dusty hats and worn coats sized her up, their gazes lingering in ways that made her skin crawl. The wind whipped through the street, carrying the stench of manure and fear. It was a world away from the clean, orderly life she had known, a world of prayer and quiet work. The auctioneer, a portly man with a face as red as a summer tomato, raised his hands for silence. His voice boomed across the dusty square, a grotesque parody of the preachers she'd grown up with. "Ladies and gentlemen, a special item for you this fine morning," he bellowed, his voice dripping with false enthusiasm. "A young woman of good breeding and strong back, straight from the Amish country of Pennsylvania." Rebecca flinched. Good breeding, strong back. They were talking about her as if she were a horse. "Skilled in cooking, cleaning, and all manner of household duties," he continued, his words like hammer blows. "Strong enough for farm work and young enough to bear children." The shame was a physical thing, a hot coal burning in her chest. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to transport herself back home, to the scent of her mother's baking and the sound of her father's gentle voice reading from the good book. But the memory was shattered by a new wave of pain. The image of her little brother, Jacob, his face bruised and tear-streaked. The sharp crack of Elder Zook's cane. He'd only been feeding a stray cat, a simple act of kindness that the elder had deemed wasteful, sinful. Rebecca hadn't thought. She had just acted. She had thrown herself between them, her voice ringing out in the quiet meeting house, demanding that he stop, and for that she had been condemned. "Cast out!" The words still echoed in her ears. No longer one of God's chosen people. A pariah. A disgrace. What's wrong with her that her own people threw her out? A man in the crowd yelled, his voice thick with suspicion. "Probably a thief," another shouted back. "Those religious folk don't stand for no sinning." Rebecca wanted to scream that she had only protected a child, that her only sin was love, but the words were caught in her throat, strangled by despair. Who here would believe her? In their eyes, she wasn't a person. She was merchandise, damaged merchandise. The auctioneer ignored the catcalls and prepared to begin. "Let's start the bidding at $10, he roared, pointing his gavel at the crowd. A hand shot up instantly. A grimy-looking trapper with matted hair and a missing tooth grinned up at her. $10. $15, called a slick-looking salesman, adjusting his tie. The numbers climbed, each bid a new nail in the coffin of her life. $20, $25, $30. The bids came from a fat man with gleaming gold teeth who stared at her with an unnerving hunger. He looked like a man who enjoyed breaking things. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She scanned the crowd, her gaze desperate, searching for a single shred of pity, of humanity. And that's when she saw him. He was leaning against a support post at the very back of the crowd, away from the frenzy. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn, practical clothes that spoke of long days in the saddle. Unlike the others, he wasn't shouting or pushing. He was just standing there, perfectly still, his arms crossed over his chest. His face was shadowed by the brim of his hat, but she could feel his eyes on her. They were intense, steady, and the color of a gathering storm. In the chaotic sea of faces, his stillness was an island. He wasn't bidding, he was just watching, waiting. But for what? The bidding war was heating up. The fat man with the gold teeth was sweating now, his face flushed with excitement as he shouted, $40. The salesman, not to be outdone, countered immediately, $45. Rebecca felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. The sun was relentless, beating down on the raw wood of the platform. She hadn't eaten in over a day, and the world was starting to tilt and sway at the edges. Her knees felt weak, like they might give out at any moment. She had heard stories, whispered in horrified tones back home, about what happened to women sold at these auctions. They became property in every sense of the word, their bodies and spirits broken by their new masters. Suddenly, a new voice joined the fray, cold and sharp as broken glass. $50. A hush fell over the crowd. The man who had spoken was a brute, with cruel, dead eyes and knuckles scarred from a lifetime of violence. He looked at Rebecca not with hunger, but with a chilling kind of contempt, as if he was buying something he intended to destroy. $50 was a fortune, more than most men in this town made in 2 months. The fat man and the salesman exchanged nervous glances, their bravado suddenly gone. They were out of their league. The cruel-eyed man smiled, sensing his victory. Rebecca's legs began to tremble uncontrollably. She reached out, grabbing the rough-hewn post beside her to keep from collapsing. The crowd murmured, their excitement growing. They could smell blood in the water. "Look at her, going pale!" Someone jeered. "Hope she's stronger than she looks for that price." Another laughed. The auctioneer, sensing the peak of the drama, raised his hammer. $50 going once, he boomed. Rebecca's eyes darted back to the tall stranger at the edge of the crowd. He was no longer leaning against the post. He was standing straight, his jaw set in a hard, unyielding line. His hands, which had been crossed over his chest, now hung loosely at his sides. He looked like a coiled spring, ready to snap into action at any second. But he still said nothing. $50 going twice. The auctioneer's voice echoed in the sudden silence. The hammer began its final, terrible descent. Time seemed to slow down. Rebecca could see the wood grain on the handle, the sweat on the auctioneer's wrist. This was it, the end of her life. Then a voice cut through the air, calm and clear as a river stone. $100. Every single head in the crowd whipped around. The sound was so unexpected, so powerful, that it silenced every other noise in the street. The tall stranger took a single step forward, out of the shadows and into the harsh sunlight. He moved with a quiet confidence that was more intimidating than any shout. The cruel-eyed man stared, his mouth agape. The fat man looked like he'd seen a ghost. Even the auctioneer was stunned into silence. $100, the stranger repeated, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the square. In gold. He wasn't just bidding, he was ending the conversation. And as he walked through the parting crowd, his boots kicking up dust with each steady step, Rebecca realized something terrifying. The man who had just saved her from a monster might be a different kind of monster entirely. Did I hear that right?" The auctioneer stammered, his face a mask of disbelief. $100? You heard right, the stranger said, his calm gaze never leaving Rebecca. He reached the foot of the platform and looked up, and for the first time, she saw his face clearly. It was weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of hardship. But his eyes held an intelligence and a depth that startled her. They were gray like a stormy sky, but they weren't cruel. They were sad. Whispers rippled through the crowd as people finally recognized him. "That's James McKenna," one man muttered to his neighbor. "Owns that big spread north of town." "McKenna? Thought he kept to himself," another replied. "Ain't been the same since he lost his wife and boy to the fever a few years back." The news hit Rebecca with unexpected force. This man, this silent stranger, had known profound loss. He understood what it was to have your world ripped out from under you. Maybe that's why he looked at her not with lust or contempt, but with something that looked dangerously like understanding. The auctioneer, finally recovering his senses, slammed his hammer down with a resounding crack. "Sold to Mr. James McKenna for $100. The show was over. The crowd began to break apart, the men grumbling about the unexpected finale. The cruel-eyed man spat on the ground and stormed away, muttering curses under his breath. A deputy climbed the steps and untied the ropes from Rebecca's wrists. The skin beneath was red and raw. She rubbed them, trying to bring feeling back into her numb fingers. "Come on down, miss," the deputy said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "Your new owner is waiting." Owner? The word sent a fresh shiver of fear down her spine. She walked down the wooden steps on legs that felt like jelly. Every nightmare she'd ever had was about to come true. She was now the property of a powerful, mysterious man who had just spent a fortune on her. What would he expect in return for his investment? The possibilities were too horrific to contemplate. James McKenna waited for her at the bottom of the steps. He had taken off his hat, holding it respectfully in his hands. Up close, he was even taller than she'd thought, and the sadness in his eyes was even more pronounced. "Miss Yoder," he said, his voice soft. "I'm James McKenna." Rebecca could only nod, too shocked to speak. He knew her name, and he addressed her as Miss Yoder, not girl or property. It was the first shred of dignity she'd been shown in weeks. "I have a proposition for you," he continued, his gray eyes holding hers. Rebecca braced herself for the worst. "I need someone to run my household, a housekeeper. The work is honest, the pay is fair, and you'd have your own room." He paused, his gaze unwavering. There would be no other expectations. Rebecca stared at him, bewildered. I don't understand." "I'm offering you a job, Miss Yoder," he said plainly. "Not ownership. You'd work for wages, just like any of my ranch hands. If you decide the arrangement doesn't suit you, you are free to leave at any time." The deputy, who had been listening nearby, let out a low whistle. "That's mighty peculiar, McKenna. A man pays $100 in gold. He usually expects to own what he bought." James didn't even glance at the deputy. His attention was entirely on Rebecca. "I'm not most men," he said simply. "The choice is yours, Miss Yoder. What do you say?" A choice. The word was so foreign, so powerful, it almost brought her to her knees. No one had given her a choice about anything in her entire life. Decisions were made by elders, by fathers, by a mob of strangers. Now this man who had every right to treat her like an animal was offering her freedom. "Why?" she whispered, the single word scraping her raw throat. "Why would you do this?" James McKenna was silent for a long moment. His gaze drifted to the empty auction block, the scene of her humiliation. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with a sorrow that seemed bottomless. "Because no one," he said, "should have to stand where you just stood, and because I know what it feels like to have everything taken away from you." He met her eyes again. "Everyone deserves a chance to build it back." Something in his voice, a raw and honest pain, connected with her own. He wasn't just being kind. He was acting from a place of shared suffering. She had secrets. He had scars. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't another trap. "I'll come with you," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. He gave a slight nod, settling his hat back on his head. "My wagon is across the street. We'll collect your things." Rebecca almost let out a bitter laugh. "I don't have any things." A flicker of something, anger perhaps, crossed his face. "Then we'll get you some," he said, his tone firm. He started walking, and the crowd instinctively parted for him. As they crossed the dusty street toward a sturdy wagon, Rebecca noticed something strange. He wasn't just a rancher. He carried an aura of authority, of quiet power that made people step aside without a word. This man hadn't just bought her. He had protected her. But as he helped her onto the wagon seat, his hand gentle but strong on her arm, a new chilling thought took root in her mind. A man this powerful, this wealthy, this willing to defy convention. What kind of enemies did a man like that have? And had she just traded one cage for another, far more dangerous one? The bell above the door of Morton's General Store chimed, a cheerful sound that was completely at odds with the turmoil in Rebecca's soul. James McKenna had led her inside, the scent of leather, coffee beans, and dried apples filling the air. He walked over to the counter and spoke in a low voice to the proprietor, a balding man named Mr. Morton. "My new housekeeper, Miss Yoder, needs a full outfit," James said, placing a few heavy gold coins on the counter. "Dresses, shoes, undergarments, a coat, whatever she requires. Put it on my account." Mr. Morton's eyes widened at the sight of the gold, then flickered over to Rebecca, his expression a mixture of curiosity and pity. Rebecca stood frozen near the door, acutely aware of her torn dress and bare, dirty feet. She felt like an imposter, a stray dog brought into a fine house. Go on, James said, his voice gentle but firm, gesturing toward the racks of ready-made dresses. Pick what you need. She moved slowly, her fingers hesitating as they brushed against the fabrics. Calico, gingham, even a dark blue wool that felt impossibly soft. Back home, her clothes were plain, functional, made of rough homespun fabric in muted colors. These dresses had buttons, lace collars, and patterns that seemed sinfully vibrant. It was another world. As she chose a simple brown dress in a pair of sturdy-looking boots, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was all a dream, or worse, an elaborate deception. Why would a man spend so much money on a stranger? Kindness like this didn't exist in her world. It always came with a price. They rode out of Dodge City in silence, the wagon loaded with her new belongings. The town quickly fell away, replaced by the vast, unending expanse of the Kansas prairie. The sky was a brilliant, aching blue, and the horizon stretched on forever. It was beautiful, but it was also intimidating. It was a land that could swallow a person whole. Can I ask you something? Rebecca finally ventured, her voice small against the rumble of the wagon wheels. Of course. You could have bought me for much less, she said, looking at her hands folded in her lap. Why did you wait until the bidding was so high? Why did you bid $100? James kept his eyes on the road, his profile unreadable. I wasn't just buying a housekeeper, Miss Yoder, he said, his voice flat. I was sending a message. A message? To whom? To men like that, he said, his jaw tightening. The ones who see people as things to be bought and broken. I wanted them to know that this one was not for them, that she was under my protection. He glanced at her, and his eyes were like chips of flint. $100 is a price high enough to make even the cruelest man think twice before causing trouble. A cold dread washed over Rebecca. He wasn't just being charitable. He was preparing for a fight. He had intentionally painted a target on her back, marking her as his in the most public way possible, just to warn off predators. It was a terrifyingly strategic move. He hadn't just rescued her. He had claimed her in a way that was far more binding than any bill of sale. The McKenna Ranch was nestled in a green valley, a world away from the dust of Dodge. A sturdy, handsome house stood beside a clear, running creek, shaded by tall cottonwood trees. It was peaceful, it was beautiful, and it felt like the most dangerous place on earth. The next few weeks passed in a strange, tense rhythm. Rebecca threw herself into her work, scrubbing floors, baking bread, mending clothes, trying to make herself indispensable. She was determined to prove she was worth the $100, worth the risk he had taken. James was a ghost in his own home. He was polite but distant, leaving before dawn and returning after dusk, his face etched with a weariness that went bone deep. He ate the meals she prepared in silence, his mind clearly 1,000 miles away. The house was large, but it was filled with an emptiness that was deafening. There was a bedroom upstairs, its door always closed. One afternoon, driven by a desperate need to understand the man she was living with, she pushed the door open. The room was a child's bedroom, frozen in time. A small wooden horse sat in the corner. A well-read book of adventure stories lay on the nightstand. The blankets on the bed were neatly turned down, as if waiting for a boy who would never return. The grief in that room was so thick, so palpable, that Rebecca had to back out, gasping for air. That night she broke a jar of peaches, the glass shattering on the kitchen floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent house. She stared at the mess, her hand bleeding from a small cut, and felt tears of frustration welling in her eyes. It was just a jar, but it felt like a monumental failure. James appeared in the doorway, drawn by the noise. He looked from the broken glass to her bleeding hand. She braced herself for the anger, for the reprimand. "Let me see that," he said instead, his voice rough with concern. He crossed the room in 2 strides, taking her hand gently in his large calloused ones. He inspected the cut with a surprising tenderness. "It's just a jar, Rebecca," he said softly, for the first time using her given name. "Accidents happen." His kindness was more unnerving than any anger would have been. In her world, waste was a sin. Mistakes were punished. This gentle acceptance was completely alien. As he wrapped her finger with a clean cloth, his touch lingering for a moment too long, she realized the truth. The silence in this house wasn't just about grief. It was about control. He was a man who had lost everything, and he was holding himself together with a will of iron. And she, a stranger with a dangerous past, was now living in the heart of his carefully constructed fortress. A fortress that, she was beginning to suspect, was already under siege, and the real storm hadn't even begun. "Stay inside," James said, his voice low and urgent. He moved away from the kitchen window, his entire demeanor changing in an instant. The quiet, grieving rancher was gone. In his place stood a man who was alert, wary, and dangerous. Rebecca crept to the window and peered out. 6 men on horseback were riding up the valley, kicking up a cloud of dust behind them. The man in the lead wore a sheriff's badge that glinted in the morning sun. "Who are they?" she whispered, her heart starting to pound. "Trouble," James said grimly. He strode to a tall wooden cabinet by the fireplace, opened it, and pulled out a gun belt. He strapped it around his waist with a fluid, practiced motion that told Rebecca this was not the first time he had prepared for a fight. The worn leather creaked as he settled the heavy pistol on his hip. "Sheriff Reeves," James explained, his eyes never leaving the approaching riders. "He's been looking for an excuse to cause me problems for a long time." "What kind of excuse?" Rebecca asked, her blood running cold. James's jaw tightened. He looked at her, his gray eyes dark with something she couldn't decipher. "The kind that involves you." Her mind raced. Had her past caught up to her already? Had someone from her Amish community sent the law after her? The riders reined in their horses in front of the house, the animals snorting and stamping in the dirt. Sheriff Reeves, a big barrel-chested man with cold blue eyes, dismounted. His men spread out, their hands resting casually on the grips of their pistols. It wasn't a friendly visit. It was an intimidation tactic. A loud, demanding knock rattled the front door. "McKenna, open up! Sheriff's business!" James put a hand on Rebecca's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "Stay in the kitchen. Don't say a word unless I tell you to. Don't admit to anything." He walked to the door and opened it, stepping out onto the porch to block the entrance. Rebecca pressed herself against the wall, straining to hear. "Sheriff Reeves," James said, his tone polite but icy. "To what do I owe the pleasure of this armed delegation?" "Cut the pleasantries, McKenna," Reeves's voice boomed. "You know why I'm here. That girl you bought at the auction. Where is she?" "Miss Yoder is my employee," James replied calmly, "and her whereabouts are none of your concern unless you have a warrant for her arrest." There was a tense pause. Rebecca could almost feel the hatred radiating from the sheriff. "I don't need a warrant to ask a few questions," Reeves sneered. "There are concerns about her past, things that might interest the law." "What thing?" James pressed, his voice like steel. "Let's just say she's wanted," Reeves said vaguely, "for questioning, back in Pennsylvania." It was a lie, it had to be. She'd been cast out, not charged with a crime. But how could she prove it? "Unless you can produce a legal warrant from a Pennsylvania court, Miss Yoder doesn't have to answer any of your questions," James said, his voice unwavering. "And I'd advise you and your men to get off my property." "Now see here, McKenna," Reeves blustered, his voice rising in anger. "You're obstructing a lawful investigation. I am the law in this county." "Then you, of all people, should know how it works," James shot back. 6 armed men showing up at a private residence without legal papers to harass an innocent woman looks a lot more like a lynch mob than an investigation. Rebecca dared to peek through the window again. Reeves's face was purple with rage. He was used to getting his way, to bullying and intimidating people. James McKenna was not a man who could be bullied. "You're making a big mistake, McKenna," the sheriff snarled, pointing a thick finger at him. "That girl is trouble, and anyone who harbors a fugitive is going to regret it. Deeply." "Is that a threat, Sheriff?" James asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "It's a promise," Reeves spat. He held James's gaze for another long, tense moment, then seemed to realize he wasn't going to win. Not today. He turned and stomped back to his horse. "This isn't over," he called back over his shoulder. I didn't think it would be, James replied. As the posse rode away, James came back inside, his face a grim mask. He closed and bolted the door, an action Rebecca had never seen him take before. The fortress was now on lockdown. What did he mean? I'm wanted, Rebecca asked, her voice trembling. He's lying, James said, unbuckling his gun belt and placing it back in the cabinet. Or at least he's twisting the truth. He's a bully and he's trying to find leverage against me. Because of me? Partly, he admitted, finally looking at her. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully. Reeves and I have a history. He works for men who want this land. They've been trying to force me out for years. Bringing you here, a woman with a mysterious past, it gives him a new weapon to use against me. Rebecca sank into a kitchen chair, the weight of it all crushing her. She hadn't escaped trouble at all. She had walked right into the middle of a war. I should leave, she whispered, before I bring more danger to you. No, James said, his voice absolute. You're not going anywhere. Running is what they want. He sat down across from her, his gray eyes searching her face. But if we're going to fight them, I need to know the truth. All of it. What really happened in Pennsylvania, Rebecca? The question hung in the air between them. He was offering his protection, his home, his very life to defend her. But it came at a price, her secrets. And as she looked into his steady waiting eyes, she realized he had secrets of his own. That cabinet held more than just a gun. It held a history he wasn't sharing. And she was terrified that an honest answer from her might give his enemies exactly the ammunition they needed to destroy them both. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a nervous young boy on a scrawny pony who looked like he'd rather be facing a rattlesnake than riding up to the McKenna ranch. Rebecca was in the garden pulling weeds from a patch of stubborn carrots when she saw him approaching. The boy held out a folded piece of paper as if it were on fire. Message for a Miss Rebecca Yoder, he said, refusing to dismount. From the telegraph office in town. Rebecca's hands went cold. A message. For her. How was that possible? No one was supposed to know where she was. No one from her old life could possibly have found her here, in this hidden valley. She took the telegram with trembling fingers and watched the boy wheel his pony around and gallop away, as if the devil himself were on his heels. The paper felt impossibly heavy. Her name was written on the outside in a neat, unfamiliar script. Was it from Sheriff Reeves? A trick? A summons? She took a deep, shuddering breath and unfolded it. The words were stark, separated by the clipped cadence of the telegraph wire. Rebecca. Stop. Family searching for you. Stop. You are not in trouble. Stop. Come home. Stop. Father. The world seemed to lurch to a stop. Family. Not in trouble. Come home. It was everything she had secretly prayed for. A reprieve from the exile she had been sentenced to. The shame, the disgrace. It was all a mistake. They wanted her back. Good news? James's voice made her jump. He had come up behind her so quietly she hadn't heard him. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed on the piece of paper in her hand. I think so, she stammered, handing it to him. It's from my father. He says they're looking for me, that I'm not in trouble. James read the message, his brow furrowed in thought. He read it a second time. This is good, he said slowly, though he didn't sound convinced. This means you can go home. Yes, she said, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees. But if I'm not in trouble, then why did Sheriff Reeves say I was wanted by the law? Why did he come here? That, James said, his eyes narrowing, is a very good question. He looked from the telegram to the horizon, as if searching for an answer in the distant hills. This doesn't add up. Mind if I ask? What really happened? The day you were cast out. The time for secrets was over. Taking a steadying breath, Rebecca told him everything. About her little brother Jacob and the stray cat. About Elder Zuck's cruel, self-righteous anger and the cane he used to correct the boy. He was beating him, she said, her voice thick with renewed anger. For an act of kindness? I saw the welts rising on my brother's arms, and something inside me just snapped. I pushed the elder away from him. I yelled at him to stop. James's jaw was a hard, angry line. You defended a child from being abused. I struck a minister of the church, she corrected, the ingrained shame still potent. In our community, a woman does not question an elder's authority. Ever. They called it pride, rebellion. They said I had chosen the world over God, and they cast me out with nothing but the clothes on my back. They were wrong, James said, his voice a low growl. What you did was not a sin. It was courage. The validation from him, the simple, unequivocal statement, was like a balm on a wound she thought would never heal. But before she could even process the relief, a new sound shattered the morning calm. The thunder of approaching hooves. But this wasn't Sheriff Reeves and his 6 deputies. This was a dozen men. They were riding hard, their faces grim and set. They weren't lawmen. They were rough, dangerous-looking men, the kind who lived by the gun and took what they wanted. They carried rifles in their saddle scabbards and wore their pistols tied low on their hips. Inside. Now, James ordered, his hand already moving toward the front door of the house, where he now kept his gun belt hanging just inside. Rebecca scrambled into the kitchen and peered through the curtains as the riders fanned out, surrounding the house in a practiced, military-like formation. Their leader was a tall, lean man with a jagged scar running down his left cheek. His eyes, even from this distance, looked like chips of ice. He dismounted and strode toward the porch with the swagger of a man who had never lost a fight. "McKenna!" the scarred man yelled, his voice like gravel. "We know you're in there. We need to have a little talk." James stepped out onto the porch, his body positioned to shield the doorway. He hadn't strapped on his gun yet, a deliberate choice, Rebecca realized, to avoid immediate bloodshed. "I don't believe we've been introduced," James said, his voice deceptively calm. The man smirked, a chilling, humorless expression. "Name's Carson. I'm retrieval specialist, working for some very interested parties back east." Rebecca's blood turned to ice. Interested parties back east. It could only mean one thing, her community, but they wouldn't hire men like this. Would they? "And what is it you've been hired to retrieve?" James asked. "Not a what. A who," Carson said, his cold eyes scanning the house. "We're looking for a young woman. Goes by the name of Rebecca Yoder. We have it on good authority you know where she is." "Never heard the name," James lied smoothly. Carson let out a short, harsh laugh. "That's funny, because I have 3 sworn witnesses who saw you pay $100 for her at public auction not 4 weeks ago. Now, are you going to make this easy, or are we going to have to tear this pretty little ranch of yours apart board by board?" "My housekeeper's past is her own business," James said, his voice dropping an octave. "Not when there's a $500 bounty on her head," Carson replied, playing his trump card. Rebecca gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. $500. It was an astronomical sum, a king's ransom. Someone didn't just want her back. They wanted her back at any cost. But the telegram, her father had said she wasn't in trouble. Was the message a lie? A trap to lure her out? $500 seems like a lot for a simple church disciplinary matter, James observed, stalling for time. Carson's smile widened, becoming something truly predatory. "Oh, it ain't simple, McKenna. Not at all." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the words hang in the air. "It stopped being simple when she committed murder." The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Murder. Rebecca felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. It was a lie. A monstrous, impossible lie. She had never hurt anyone in her life, not really. Pushing an old man was a world away from taking his life. This had to be a mistake. A terrible, twisted misunderstanding. "You've got the wrong person," James said, his voice flat and hard as granite. He took a half step back, his hand now hovering inches from the doorway, inches from his gun. "That's for the law back in Pennsylvania to decide," Carson shot back, his hand dropping to rest on the butt of his own pistol. "Elder Zuck, the man she assaulted, he died from his injuries 2 days after she fled. We have sworn statements. Witnesses." Witnesses? What witnesses could possibly lie about something so horrific? "That's not all," Carson continued, clearly enjoying himself. "The night before she ran, she also stole $500 from the church poor box. Seems she needed some traveling money. The amount was an echo of the bounty. It was too neat. Too perfect. This wasn't justice. It was a frame-up. Someone was meticulously building a cage of lies around her, and these men were the ones sent to lock the door. Rebecca couldn't hide any longer. She couldn't let James die for her. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she pushed the door open and stepped out onto the porch, blinking in the harsh sunlight. "I am Rebecca Yoder," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "And every word you just said is a lie." Carson's scarred face split into a triumphant grin. "Well, well, the little church mouse decides to come out of her hole." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. "It's all right here, sweetheart. A signed affidavit from an elder Miller says he saw you strike Zuck down with a fireplace poker. And another from an elder Weaver says he saw you break into the strongbox yourself." Elder Miller, Elder Weaver, they were respected men, men she had known her whole life. Why would they lie? What could possibly motivate them to condemn her to death? "They're mistaken," she whispered, her mind reeling. "Mistaken?" Carson laughed. "I call it murder and theft, and we're here to take you back to stand trial." "She's not going anywhere with you," James said, his voice a low growl. The 12 men shifted, their hands moving to their guns. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with the promise of violence. Rebecca looked at James, standing his ground against a dozen armed men, ready to die for her. And she knew she couldn't let that happen. She had brought this plague to his door, and she had to be the one to lead it away. "No," she said, stepping forward. "He's right. If there are charges against me, I have to face them." "Rebecca, don't," James warned, his eyes pleading with her. "It's the only way," she said, looking at him, trying to memorize the lines of his face. "This has to end. I won't have your blood on my hands." She turned to Carson, lifting her chin. "I'll go with you, but you have to give me your word that you will not harm Mr. McKenna or anyone on this ranch." Carson looked from her to James, a flicker of surprise in his cold eyes. He shrugged. "Fine by me. Saves me the ammunition." He gestured for 2 of his men to dismount. "Tie her hands." As the men approached with a length of rope, Rebecca held out her wrists, her heart a cold, dead weight in her chest. This was it. She was trading her life for James's. It was the only decent thing she could do. But just as the rough rope touched her skin, something strange happened. James relaxed. The tension drained out of his shoulders. He even let out a small, almost imperceptible sigh. Then he did the most unexpected thing of all. He smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was sharp, cunning, and terrifying. "You know what, Carson?" he said, his voice suddenly light and conversational. "I think the little lady has the right idea. This is a legal matter. It should be handled properly." He clapped his hands together once. "Let's all take a ride into town. We'll go see the federal marshal. Sort this whole mess out with proper legal authority." Carson frowned, thrown off by James's sudden change in demeanor. He had been expecting a gunfight, a bloody siege. This sudden, cheerful cooperation was suspicious. "What trick are you trying to play, McKenna?" "No trick," James said, holding his hands up in a gesture of surrender. "Just a firm belief in the American legal system. You have your sworn statements. We'll present them to the marshal. Everything by the book." Rebecca stared at him, utterly bewildered. Was he insane? He was handing her over. After everything, he was just giving up. But then she saw it, a tiny, almost invisible flicker in his gray eyes. It was a signal, a silent message meant only for her. "Trust me." Carson, smelling an easy victory and the jingle of $500 in his pocket, finally shrugged. "Fine with me. Her guilt's already proven. A ride to town just makes it official." As his men boosted Rebecca onto the back of a horse and tied her hands to the saddle horn, she watched James. He moved toward his own horse with a calm, deliberate pace. But as he swung into the saddle, she saw him subtly shift his weight, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled something out, something small and metallic, and with a movement so quick it was almost invisible, he palmed it. It wasn't a weapon. It was something else. Something he had been waiting to use. James McKenna hadn't surrendered. He had just moved the battlefield, and he was leading a dozen armed men straight into a trap. The main street of Dodge City was buzzing with its usual midday chaos. But as their grim procession rode into town, A dozen rough-looking bounty hunters, a bound woman, and a single silent man following behind. A hush fell over the crowd. People stopped and stared, sensing that something significant and dangerous was about to unfold. Carson rode with a smug, triumphant air, leading Rebecca's horse toward the sheriff's office. He was a conqueror parading his prize. Rebecca kept her eyes fixed on James, who rode a few paces behind, his face a calm, unreadable mask. He hadn't said a word the entire ride, but she could feel his coiled energy, the sense of a plan about to be sprung. They were halfway to the sheriff's office when a man stepped out from the alleyway beside the bank. He was a tall, rangy man with a drooping mustache and a U.S. Deputy Marshal badge pinned to his vest. He held a Winchester rifle cradled in his arms. "That's far enough, Carson," the marshal said, his voice carrying easily in the sudden quiet. Carson and his men reined in their horses, surprised. "Marshal Porter," Carson said, his tone turning sour. "This ain't federal business. Just delivering a fugitive to the local law." "Funny," Porter said, taking a slow step forward, "because according to a telegram I received this morning, it's very much federal business." At that exact moment, other men began to emerge, from the doorways of the general store and the saloon, from the rooftop of the land office, from the alley across the street. In seconds, Carson and his men were surrounded by at least 15 grim-faced men, all holding rifles, all wearing the badge of a U.S. Marshal. Carson's face went pale. He looked around wildly, like a cornered animal. "What is this? What's going on?" James McKenna finally urged his horse forward, stopping beside the marshal. He reached into his coat and pulled out not one, but 3 separate telegrams. "It's called due process, Carson," James said, his voice ringing with authority. "Something you seem to have forgotten." He handed the first telegram to Marshal Porter, who read it aloud for the entire street to hear. "Message from Sheriff William Hayes, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania," Porter boomed. "Received 8:15 this morning. Quote, Elder Zook is alive and well. Reports of his death are false. No murder has occurred. No theft has been reported from any church fund. The bounty hunters led by a man named Carson are operating without any legal authority. Consider them armed and dangerous fugitives from justice." End quote. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Alive. Elder Zuck was alive. The foundation of Carson's entire claim had just crumbled into dust. Carson looked like he'd been punched in the gut. That's a lie, a forgery," he stammered. "Is it?" James said coolly. "Because we have 2 more. Porter took the second telegram. A sworn statement from Elder Samuel Miller, transmitted under federal protection. Quote, "My previous testimony regarding Rebecca Yoder was given under duress. Elder Weaver threatened my family. Rebecca Yoder did not harm Elder Zook, nor did she steal any money. She is an innocent. I deeply regret my cowardice." End quote. Tears streamed freely down Rebecca's face. Elder Miller had found his courage. He had told the truth. "And finally," Porter said, his voice full of satisfaction, "a message from a Mr. Jacob Yoder." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. Jacob. Quote, "My sister Rebecca saved me. She did nothing wrong. The elders who cast her out have admitted they acted out of anger and pride, not justice. They are the ones who have sinned against God. Please bring my sister home safe." End quote. Carson made a desperate suicidal move, grabbing for his pistol, but before his fingers could even touch the handle, 3 rifles clicked in unison, their muzzles trained on his chest. "I wouldn't," Marshal Porter said calmly. "But the warrants, the affidavits." Carson sputtered, his bravado completely gone. "The affidavits were forgeries," James explained, his voice cutting and precise. "Provided to you by one man, Elder Weaver. You see, I had a feeling our friend Sheriff Reeves wasn't acting alone. So 3 days ago, I hired my own investigators, former Pinkerton agents, and sent them to Pennsylvania." He let that sink in. It didn't take them long to discover that Elder Weaver has been embezzling from the church poor box for the last 10 years. When Rebecca's casting out brought unwanted attention to the church's finances, he panicked. He invented a murder and a theft to frame an innocent girl, hired you to get rid of her permanently, and planned to use the stolen money to disappear. Rebecca stared at James, her mind reeling. 3 days ago, before Carson had even arrived. While she had been worrying about his silence and his grief, he had been orchestrating a multi-state investigation, anticipating every move his enemies would make. The small metallic object she'd seen him palm before they left the ranch, it was a telegraph key. He'd had a private line run to his ranch months ago, a secret weapon in his war against the men trying to take his land. He wasn't just a rancher, he was a general. Carson, Marshal Porter said, his voice booming with official finality, you and your men are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, and impersonating officers of the court. As the marshals moved in, disarming the stunned bounty hunters, James walked over to Rebecca. With his own hands, he gently untied the ropes from her wrists. It's over, he said softly. You're free. She was free. The lies had been exposed. Her name had been cleared. But as she looked at James, at this incredible man who had moved heaven and earth to save her, she realized freedom wasn't as simple as being untied. Her father's message had said, come home. She could go back to Pennsylvania, back to her family, or she could stay here with the man who had shown her what it truly meant to fight for what was right. James seemed to read her thoughts. He pulled one last piece of paper from his pocket. It wasn't a telegram. It was a letter. This arrived with the last message, he said quietly. It's personal. It was from her father. His familiar, careful handwriting filled the page. My dearest daughter, the truth has been revealed, and our community is shamed by the actions of a few wicked men. You are cleared of all wrongdoing. More than that, you are hailed as a hero. Your courage has inspired us all. We would welcome you home with open arms and joyful hearts. But the choice, my Rebecca, must be yours and yours alone. The life you left is here for you, if you want it. But I have a feeling you have already begun to build a new one. Whatever path you choose, know that your father loves you and is unendingly proud of the woman you have become. She looked up from the letter, her eyes locking with James's. He stood there waiting, his expression carefully neutral. He wouldn't influence her. He wouldn't ask her to stay. He had given her back her life, and now he was giving her the freedom to choose what to do with it. You could go home, he said, his voice rough. They want you back. You'd be safe there. Safe? She repeated, a small smile touching her lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. I've never felt safer than I do right here. She took a step closer to him. My father is right. I have started a new life, and I have no intention of leaving it. A slow smile spread across James McKenna's face, reaching his sad gray eyes and lighting them from within. Is that a job acceptance, Miss Yoder? I think it's more of a partnership proposal, Mr. McKenna, she replied. As the sun began to set over the Kansas plains, casting long shadows across the dusty street, Rebecca knew her journey wasn't over. It had just begun. She had been cast out of one community only to find the strength to build another, one founded not on rigid rules and blind obedience, but on courage, truth, and the unwavering belief that everyone, no matter how lost, deserves a second chance. And as she and James walked toward his wagon, leaving the chaos and the captured villains behind, they weren't just two lonely, wounded people anymore. They were the start of something new, something the frontier had never seen before. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another thrilling tale from the Untamed West.